So I finished reading the Winterlong series by Elizabeth Hand, and this is so I've read so far 5 books from her. The trilogy being 3 books. I've read from her actually. I really enjoyed that trilogy. So there's a lot of bioengineering within the trilogy. I don't want to say biomech because although there are some mechanical elements being introduced with the bioengineering side of things, it's more like biomutations. They're messing up with humans and animals and mixing DNAs of both these things to create these other races, essentially. It's a concept that I really enjoyed actually in the books. It's something that it's more evident like in book number 3 than it is in book 1 or 2. Actually, in book 1, it's more they're messing up with the mind of teenagers essentially to create these powerful psychic persons essentially in book 1. In book 2, we see kind of more the reviving of the dead, so it's kind of this fear of dying, and they're always like recreating their death, and they're called Raza essentially. And in book number 3, we kind of see more the gene slaves, so the people that are doing these weird experiments with animals and humans to create these weird experiments. So book 1 starts in a research lab where you have all these weird experiments done on teenagers, and we're following this teenager, so this young girl named Wendy, and we're just following from her point of view. So she's the narrator at first, and then we follow her twin brother, who is the second narrator, so Raphael. Both of them are kind of involved in a scheme to bring out this god, deity, witch person, weird thing actually. And yeah, that thing is going to come into play more in book 3, because in book 2 we don't really see Wendy nor Raphael, because book 2 takes place in another city. So book 1 was in Washington DC, so in the post-apocalyptic Washington DC, after the fallout of what we guess is nuclear war. It's never fully explained, but you have all these rains, acid rains and poisonous areas and stuff like this happening. And so book 2 takes place in a domed city, so to protect itself from the, as I said, hazard following the fallout of this war that happened, that my guess is nuclear war once again. But so book 2 takes place in Arabath, so as I said, the domed city. Sorry. We're following a lot of different characters, but mainly the Raza. So the Raza is an undead essentially. He was revived because he died in book number 1. I'm not gonna spoil who that person is. He's not a really an important character in book number. He is an important character, but he's not a main character in book 1. But he becomes kind of the focal point from now on. In book 2 and 3, he kind of becomes one of the main characters actually. And so I'm just gonna call him the Raza because I don't want to spoil his name once again. So in book 2, we're following him. He's kind of a quest to find that ultimate robot, because you have these robots that are kind of the knowledge. They are not living, but they are libraries essentially. They have all these knowledge inside their head. So the Raza is trying to find the ultimate robot, who is essentially a military library. So he's trying to find that robot. We don't really know why. It's never fully explained. What are his plans actually? Even in the end, like, we don't really know what were his plans, in book 3 actually, but more on that a bit later. So we're following this guy, and then the city just crumble. So it reminded me, from the Bible, the story of Sodom and Gomorrah, both these cities that were city of vice, essentially. And it's kind of the same thing in here with Araboth, so city of vice that gets destroyed by a god. I really enjoyed that. There are some other religious imagery throughout the trilogy, just one other that I'm going to talk a little bit more in book number 3. So book number 3 takes us back with Wendy. Essentially, we no longer see her twin brother. It's not clear if he's dead or not. It's just he's no longer really a character in the story. So we're following Wendy after the events that took place in Washington D.C. So she's close to there actually in the beginning of the story, and then she's being thrown into the rebellion, kind of against her will. She's more or less a prisoner from the rebellion. And we're still following the Raza, so he's on this quest to finding that robot, so Metatron. So I read a little bit about Metatron only because, while reading, just because it kind of reminded me of something, but I wanted to know, who that person was. I knew it was something religious once again, and he's kind of the guy who helped Moses and the refugees out of the desert. So he kind of the guy who showed the way out of the desert, and that comes into play in book number 3 in a weird way. So Metatron is kind of the savior of humanity in his mind. And also, so the Raza is trying to find Metatron. Essentially, now we have the name of the robot. And also he's trying to stop the rebellion. So that's mainly it. I don't want to give any spoilers or anything. So that's going to be mainly kind of the overview of the story. It's a sci-fi story, set in a post-apocalyptic world. There are some horror elements in here, also some fantasy elements. I talked a little bit about this in, while talking about gods and witches, maybe, weird psychic powers and stuff like this. But it's more, sci-fi than anything else. But I really enjoyed this trilogy, mainly because I love horror and I love sci-fi, and you have both these things in the trilogy, which I really enjoyed. And I'm not that of a fan of fantasy, but here the fantasy elements, kind of fit with the story, because it was just more in the background. It was not, in the foreground. It was not high fantasy or anything. It was just, subdued here and there. So I'm going to rank my books. So number 1 is going to be my favorite book, and at the 3rd place is going to be my least favorite. So at the 1st place, so the book that I've enjoyed the most was book number 3, just because of the ending. Like, it's just so good. I know I said in a previous video that I didn't really care much about the end, but in here, like, the end is just really amazing. You won't see it coming. Some might say that it's far-fetched, like that it comes out of nowhere or something. Even though it kind of is, it fits with the tone of the book and kind of the message that the book is trying to convey, actually. So book 3, my favorite book out of the trilogy. So in the 2nd place it will be book number 1, just because it sets all these things, and at first it's kind of weird because you don't really understand what's going on. I really enjoyed that feeling of, being thrown into a world, not knowing anything actually, and it's just weird at first, and the more you read, the more you familiarize yourself with the story. So I really enjoyed that actually from book number 1, and also all these different talks about different religions, different belief systems. I really enjoyed that from book number 1. And at the 3rd place would be book number 2. I really enjoyed it. When I did my review on book number 2, I said I preferred it with book number 1. I changed my mind after reading the whole trilogy, mainly because book number 2 feels more like, feel a little bit out of place. I understand why it's there. It's there to have this gap between 1 and 3, but it just feels like, I would have enjoyed to follow up with Wendy's story instead of seeing something else entirely in a different part of the United States. I would have enjoyed, keeping with the main story instead of having this quote unquote side story. It's not really, a side story. It felt like a side quest in a video game if you are a gamer. It really felt like this actually, book number 2. It felt like a side quest to divert our attention from the main story, and then we're back to the main story. That being said, though, I really enjoyed book number 2. Lastly, so my last thought on the books, it kind of shows that these books were written, during the 80s, early 90s, so during the Cold War, mainly because, once again, the nuclear fallout and all of this, and the kind of feeling that they had, of no future and just apocalyptic world that was to come, or something like this. So I really, it really felt like a book written, a book of its time. It is still relevant today, though, because we're just this close to total extinction. All it takes is just one person hitting that red button.